Charles Dickens's Hard Times is a social novel that critiques utilitarianism, industrialism, and the dehumanizing effects of a society dominated by facts at the expense of imagination, compassion, and individuality. At the center of this critique stands Thomas Gradgrind, a schoolmaster, educator, and later member of Parliament, who embodies the utilitarian philosophy Dickens set out to expose. Gradgrind is both a character and a symbol. He is at once a loving but misguided father, a rigid educationalist, and a moral figure whose gradual transformation underpins much of the novel's thematic structure. Role in the narrative. Thomas Gradgrind is introduced in the opening chapter of the novel, standing in his classroom and declaring, "Now, what I want is facts." This declaration encapsulates his philosophy. Life is to be governed by the measurable, the calculable, and the verifiable. Imagination, fancy, and emotion are excluded from his worldview. As a schoolmaster in Coketown, he subjects his pupils, most memorably Cecilia Sissy Jupe, to a relentless regime of factual learning. His children, Louisa and Tom Gradgrind Jr., are raised under the same principle. In his roles as both father and educator, Gradgrind's utilitarian ideology exerts direct consequences on the lives of those around him. Gradgrind's pedagogy sets the stage for the central conflicts of the novel. Louisa, deprived of emotional education, finds herself incapable of handling her marriage to the wealthy but repulsive Josiah Bounderby. Tom Jr., similarly deprived of a moral compass, degenerates into vice and criminality, culminating in his involvement in the robbery of Bounderby's bank. Sissy Jupe, whom Gradgrind reluctantly takes into his household after her father abandons her, becomes a foil to the Gradgrind children. Her imagination and compassion expose the sterility of Gradgrind's educational model. Thus, Gradgrind's personal decisions drive the novel's main plots and tragedies. A key narrative function of Gradgrind is his eventual change. When faced with the emotional suffering of Louisa and the moral downfall of Tom Jr., Gradgrind realizes the inadequacy of his philosophy. He softens, becoming capable of sympathy, regret, and love. Though he cannot undo the damage already inflicted, he acknowledges his mistakes, and this recognition provides one of the few notes of redemption in an otherwise grim novel. Dickens thus positions Gradgrind as a character whose personal journey mirrors the moral lessons of Hard Times. Symbolic significance. Gradgrind is Dickens's personification of utilitarian philosophy, particularly as espoused by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and James Mill. In Dickens's caricature, utilitarianism reduces human life to statistical reasoning, erasing the complexity of emotion and imagination. Gradgrind insists that children should be a mere receptacle for facts, and that nothing beyond the measurable is of value. He is symbolically the voice of an entire ideology that sought to govern education, economics, and politics in Victorian England. If Gradgrind symbolizes fact, Sissy Jupe symbolizes fancy. The juxtaposition of these two characters establishes one of the novel's central symbolic oppositions. Gradgrind's rigid factualism strips life of vitality, while Sissy's imaginative and emotional capacity preserves humanity. Sissy's ability to show compassion and loyalty, even toward the flawed Gradgrind family, highlights the limitations of Gradgrind's worldview. Symbolically, Gradgrind's eventual openness to Sissy's values suggests Dickens's call for balance between fact and fancy. Broader implications. Through Gradgrind, Dickens criticizes an education system that prizes rote memorization over emotional and moral development. Gradgrind's philosophy fails his own children. Louisa's inability to express her feelings leads to emotional paralysis, while Tom Jr.'s lack of ethical grounding leads him to moral ruin. The broader implication is that education divorced from imagination and ethics is destructive both personally and socially. Dickens's critique resonates beyond the Victorian classroom, raising questions about the purpose of education in any society. Gradgrind's eventual recognition of his errors raises the theme of personal and social responsibility. While he initially represents systemic forces, utilitarianism, industrial rationality, and rigid pedagogy, His transformation shows that individuals within these systems can change. Dickens implies that moral responsibility rests not only on institutions, but also on those who perpetuate them. Gradgrind's willingness to admit fault contrasts with Bounderby's arrogance and hypocrisy, suggesting that self-awareness and repentance, though belated, are pathways to redemption. On a broader level, Gradgrind embodies Dickens's critique of Victorian society's obsession with statistics, efficiency, and rational planning. Gradgrind is Dickens's warning against reducing human beings to numbers and society to a machine. His failure as both father and educator dramatizes the dangers of extending utilitarian principles to human life. While Gradgrind is often read as a caricature, Dickens also imbues him with humanity and complexity. Unlike Bounderby, who is exposed as a fraud and hypocrite, Gradgrind is sincere in his beliefs. He genuinely wants to do what is best for his children and students, but his rigid adherence to philosophy closes his eyes to their needs. His later recognition of his errors makes him a more nuanced figure than many of Dickens's outright villains. This complexity allows readers to see him not merely as an ideological symbol, but as a father, teacher, and man caught in the moral dilemmas of his age. Conclusion. Thomas Gradgrind is central to Dickens's hard times, both as a character within the story and as a symbolic representation of Victorian utilitarianism. In the narrative, he is the stern educator and father whose philosophy shapes the destinies of Louisa, Tom Jr., and Sissy Jupe. Symbolically, he embodies the fact-based rationality that Dickens sought to critique, a worldview that stifles imagination and compassion. The broader implications of his character extend to Dickens's indictment of educational practices, moral responsibility, and the dehumanizing effects of industrial rationality. What distinguishes Gradgrind from the novel's villains is his capacity for change. His eventual acknowledgement of the inadequacy of facts alone offers a glimmer of redemption, suggesting Dickens's belief that even those entrenched in destructive systems can learn, adapt, and grow. Gradgrind's transformation underscores one of the novel's central messages: that human life cannot be reduced to statistics and calculations, but must also embrace imagination, empathy, and moral feeling.